Under the bright lights of the congressional chamber, every camera was already trained on Donald Trump. The room was packed, tense with the kind of silence that comes when people expect fireworks, but aren't sure when they'll erupt. And then, in the middle of a question he could have brushed off, Trump leaned forward into his microphone and let the words fall from his lips. Words that didn't just target Denzel Washington, but carried a sharper edge, an insult aimed directly at the color of his skin. The sound landed like a slap across the entire chamber. For a second, it was as if the air had been punched out of the room. The shuffle of papers stopped. Pens froze in midair, and the steady hum of reporters typing on laptops suddenly went silent. Faces around the committee table stiffened, some in disbelief, others trying to keep their expressions neutral under the unforgiving gaze of television cameras. A single cough echoed through the chamber, and then nothing, just that loaded, unbearable quiet. The camera angle shifted, catching the stunned faces of representatives seated on both sides. One congressman's jaw tightened. Another glanced down at her notes as if pretending she hadn't heard what everyone clearly had. In the gallery above, a woman clasped her hands tightly, knuckles turning white, her lips pressed together so hard they quivered. It was a silence that wasn't empty. It was charged, brimming with shock and the kind of collective awareness that something had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Denzel Washington sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, his head bowed ever so slightly, as though he were letting the weight of what had just been said settle fully on his shoulders. For 5, 6, maybe 7 long seconds, he didn't speak. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the reflection of the overhead lights in his eyes. The slow inhale he drew through his nose. The calm but unshakable composure of someone who knows the moment has shifted in his favor. Then he lifted his chin, his gaze locked on Trump, sharp and steady. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried the kind of gravity that turns silence into attention. "You didn't just insult me," he said slowly, deliberately, each word clear as glass. "You insulted millions of Americans who carry this skin, this history, this truth. You insulted every child who deserves to know that the highest chambers of this country will not reduce them to the color they were born with. And you insulted the very Constitution you swore to uphold." A murmur rippled faintly across the room, like the first stir of wind before a storm. Reporters' fingers began flying again across keyboards. Scribbles of pens filled the air with a faint scratch. Every camera locked tighter on Denzel now, sensing the shape of the story changing right before them. Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, as if he had calculated this response, as if provocation was part of the show. But Denzel didn't blink. His tone sharpened, his words slicing through the chamber. "You may think this is a personal attack, something you can wave away with a laugh or another insult. But this moment doesn't belong to you alone. This belongs to the record of our democracy. It belongs to every young man and woman who watches this hearing and wonders if their voice matters. And today they will know that it does." At that exact beat, on screens across America, a hashtag began to flash into existence. #Truth over hate. Viewers watching live saw it rise on their phones, on social media tickers, at the bottom of their broadcasts, spreading like wildfire in the space of a heartbeat. The words carried a weight that people latched onto instantly, an answer to the ugliness they had just heard. Inside the chamber, the tension thickened. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, as if caught between their loyalty and the undeniable truth unfolding before them. Others leaned forward, eyes flicking between Denzel and Trump like spectators at a duel, wondering who would strike next. But Denzel wasn't finished. His voice gathered momentum, not loud, but steady, the kind of tone that doesn't scream for attention, but demands it. "You see, when you attempt to demean the color of my skin, you aren't speaking just to me. You are speaking into the living memory of this nation, into the soil where blood was spilled, into the songs sung by those who refused to be broken, into the prayers whispered by mothers who had nothing left but faith that justice would one day answer. You are speaking into the history that made this country, even if you would rather forget it. The camera caught a close-up of Trump's face, the smirk slipping slightly, his eyes narrowing in irritation at being pulled into a terrain he could not control with bluster alone. For a moment, he shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the microphone as if buying himself a second to recalibrate. Meanwhile, viewers across the country were leaning in living rooms, on phones, at coffee shops, in classrooms where the live stream had been pulled up quietly on laptops. People were holding their breath. The insult had been ugly, raw, and personal. But Denzel Washington's reply was turning it into something larger, something that transcended the insult itself. He paused, scanning the room deliberately, his eyes moving from one face to another. "This chamber," he said, voice low but cutting, "was built for accountability. If we allow hatred to sit in this seat without consequence, then we tell every child in this nation that hate has a home here, and I will not let that message stand." The final word hung in the air like the toll of a bell. Silence followed again. This time not shocked silence, but waiting silence. The kind where every ear strains for what comes next. Every heart feels the edge of a turning point. The chair of the committee shifted in his seat, papers rattling faintly. One lawmaker glanced nervously at the cameras, knowing the footage was already out of their hands, destined to loop endlessly across platforms and headlines. And still, Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, his hands folded once more, his gaze never leaving Trump's face. He had struck the first decisive blow, and the audience inside the chamber and far beyond it knew this confrontation had only just begun. By the time 5 minutes had ticked past on the official clock, the atmosphere of the entire hearing had transformed. What began as another tense session had exploded into something far more consequential. Viewers weren't just watching a clash of personalities. They were watching the moral core of the nation being tested in real time, and they weren't about to look away. That was the hook. That was the moment the country leaned closer, waiting to see what Denzel would do next, and how far Trump would go to defend what could not be defended. Outside the chamber, chaos had already begun to spread. The insult had barely left Trump's lips before the clips started racing across phones, televisions, and streaming platforms. Journalists packed into the press pen were scrambling to update headlines in real time, and the air buzzed with the frantic energy of something that could not be contained. For a brief instant, even the live broadcast faltered. An audible rumble from the crowd just outside the Capitol doors surged through the microphones, forcing producers to mute and reset their feeds. Viewers across America caught the strange pause, a flicker of static before the stream snapped back. And when it did, Denzel Washington's voice filled the silence like a measured blade. He sat forward, his words precise and deliberate. "When you insult the color of my skin, you insult the Constitution itself. When you reduce me, you reduce the very fabric of equality this nation is supposed to stand for." His voice wasn't raised, but the conviction was unmistakable. The camera zoomed in on his expression, eyes locked, steady, unwavering. He wasn't just addressing Trump now, he was addressing the country. The press outside roared again. Reporters shouting into microphones for their evening broadcasts. "Unprecedented insult on Capitol Hill," one correspondent yelled over the din. "The chamber is reeling," another declared, her voice nearly drowned by chants rising from the crowd gathered on the steps. People were already holding up phones, recording themselves reacting, voices tight with disbelief. Did we just hear that? Did the former president really go there? And even as those questions spread, Denzel's rebuttal became the center of the narrative. Inside, he continued with calm ferocity. "The framers wrote words that have echoed through generations. All people are created equal. That is not a phrase you can bend. It is not a line you can erase when it becomes inconvenient. And yet here we are, listening to words that seek to strip those guarantees away, one insult at a time." The room shifted again. Some members who had stayed rigid in their seats now leaned forward, unable to disguise the weight of what was happening. Trump crossed his arms, lips pursed. But even he seemed to sense the gravity of how quickly the moment had turned. The insult that was supposed to belittle Denzel had instead opened a door, and he was walking through it with every sentence. And then came a voice from beyond the chamber. On the large screen at the far end of the room, The live feed cut to a young woman seated in a small dorm room, her hands clutching a sheet of paper. She was a medical student in California. ChatGPT said her letter had been chosen by the committee to be read aloud during this hearing. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as she spoke. "I've dreamed of becoming a doctor since I was 7 years old," she read. "I study every night. I work 2 jobs, and I carry loans that will take years to repay. But what I fear most is not the work. It's that I may never get the chance because of the color of my friend's skin or the papers their families hold. If policies that discriminate become law, doors will close before I can even reach them. And my patients, the people who need me, will never see the care I could have given." The room hushed again. The raw honesty of her words cut straight through the political theater. She lowered the paper, eyes glassy with unshed tears. For a heartbeat, even Trump stayed silent. The cameras panned back to Denzel Washington, who nodded slowly, as though every syllable had been carved into the foundation of his argument. "This," Denzel said, gesturing toward the screen, his tone quiet but iron-strong, "is the America that hears your words. A student who carries both hope and fear in the same breath. A voice that deserves encouragement, not the weight of policies designed to diminish her worth. And she is not alone. She represents thousands, millions, who stand at the edge of opportunity, only to be told by men in power that they do not belong." His voice was steady, but it carried an unmistakable resonance. Outside, protesters who had gathered in real time began chanting louder, their voices carrying through the heavy stone walls. Reporters inside turned in their seats. Pence was moving furiously, knowing this wasn't just testimony. This was history being documented as it unfolded. Trump leaned forward into his microphone, clearing his throat as though preparing to interrupt. But before he could, Denzel cut across the silence with precision. "You want to talk about order? You want to talk about control? But what you call order, millions call injustice. And what you call control, the people call exclusion. You do not get to redefine fairness by erasing the people you do not wish to see." The words hit like a gavel. Cameras snapped. The low hum of media crews adjusting equipment filled the background. Every sentence was building towards something larger, something unavoidable. Meanwhile, the stream outside the chamber was alive with commentary across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and live chats. The clip of Trump's insult was being replayed, dissected, and then followed immediately by Denzel's fiery response. Viewers typed furiously. He didn't even flinch. He turned it right back on him. This isn't just politics. This is truth versus hate. And with each share, the hashtag truth over hate climbed higher, overtaking lighter trends, forcing networks to cover it even if they hadn't planned to. Back in the chamber, Denzel lowered his tone, his words pulling every ear toward him. "Let me remind this room what hangs in the balance. This is not about my feelings. This is about the precedent we set for the children who will watch this hearing 20 years from now. Will they see a government that bent under the weight of hate? Or will they see a man who refused to let a moment of darkness define the future of this country?" The silence that followed was heavy but electrifying. He wasn't asking for applause. He wasn't asking for acknowledgement. He was demanding reckoning. And in that silence, every viewer, whether in the gallery, on the steps outside, or watching from thousands of miles away, felt it. The question was no longer whether Trump had crossed a line. The question was what the nation would do with the line now that it was clearly drawn. Reporters whispered to each other, already shaping tomorrow's headlines. Lawmakers glanced nervously at their phones, no doubt seeing the flood of notifications lighting up. Staffers passed hurried notes down the table. And in the middle of it all, Denzel sat still, unshaken, his eyes fixed on the man across from him, his voice ready for the next strike. The tension had not broken. It was building. The insult had created the spark, but Denzel's response was turning it into a firestorm. By the close of that 10-minute mark, the hearing was no longer a simple examination. It was a confrontation between two visions of America, and everyone watching knew it was only just beginning. The silence that lingered after Denzel's words in part 2 was not empty. It was thick, layered with meaning, the kind that presses down on every person in the room and makes even the air feel charged. When he leaned back slightly, giving space for the weight of his words to settle, the microphones caught the faint shuffle of papers. ChatGPT said, the creak of leather chairs and the nervous clearing of a throat somewhere down the line. Trump, however, broke that silence with a scoff, a low, deliberate laugh that carried the sting of dismissal. He leaned toward his microphone, lips curling into a half-smile, and delivered his counter not as a reasoned response, but as a shrug meant to cut through history. Government has the right, he said, drawing out each syllable, to restore order to our immigration system. That's what this is about. Not race, not equality, order. And if you don't like it, maybe you should read the Constitution again. His words were meant to sting, meant to reclaim the authority he felt slipping from his grasp. He leaned back as though satisfied, eyes glinting with the smugness of someone who believed the final word belonged to him. But Denzel Washington was already leaning forward, his voice sharp and deliberate. Order, he repeated, tilting his head slightly. You use that word as if it erases everything else. But let me remind you what the Constitution actually says, Mr. Trump. It doesn't begin with order. It begins with equality. He pulled a folded sheet from his stack of documents and raised it slightly, though he hardly needed it. The words flowed from memory, his voice steady, resonant, almost ceremonial. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The camera zoomed in, catching the precision in his expression. He didn't blink, didn't falter, and the chamber grew still once again. These were not just lines from history books. They were being sharpened into a weapon right there in real time. Those words, he continued, his tone cutting through the air, are not decoration. They are not a suggestion. They are a promise. And every time a policy, a statement, or an insult seeks to deny them, it is not restoring order. It is breaking the very oath you swore to uphold. Trump leaned closer to his microphone, a sharp breath filling the space as if he were about to interrupt. But Denzel raised his hand slightly, commanding the room with the simplest gesture, and for the briefest moment, even Trump held back. The committee chair shifted uncomfortably, his gavel tapping once as though to remind the room of decorum. But the cameras weren't on him. They were locked on Denzel and Trump, the duel that had come to define this hearing. And then the large screen at the far wall flickered once again. This time the feed cut to a man standing in the wide-open expanse of a Georgia farm. Sunlight bounced off rows of soil behind him, the earth freshly tilled, his shirt damp with sweat from work that clearly never stopped. He held a worn cap in one hand, his voice rough but resolute. "My name is David," he said, speaking directly to the camera. "My family has farmed this land for 3 generations. We wake up before sunrise. We work until the light is gone, and we've done it with pride because we believe this land is our contribution to America. But lately I've been told my paperwork isn't enough, that because my grandparents came here under different laws, my land, my future, my family, all of it could be questioned. I've spent my life feeding this country, and now I lie awake at night wondering if someone in Washington will decide I no longer belong." The image lingered on his weathered face, the pain etched into lines carved by years of labor. His words cracked near the end, but he didn't flinch. He looked into the camera as if looking directly at Trump. "You say order. I hear eraser." The chamber was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of a point made so powerfully that even those who disagreed knew it had landed. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to keep pace with the flood of storylines unfolding. Denzel turned slightly toward Trump, his voice quiet but piercing. "This is the order you speak of. A man who feeds this country now, fearing the loss of his own ground because of a piece of paper. This is not order. This is injustice dressed up as policy." Trump shifted in his seat, clearly irritated, tapping his finger against the table. His voice rose slightly, sharp with defensiveness. "It's about protecting the nation, protecting jobs, protecting our sovereignty. People want strong borders. People want control. That's what we're doing." Denzel let him finish, then leaned forward again, his words deliberate, his gaze steady. If your definition of sovereignty is fear, if your definition of protection is exclusion, then your policies are not about America. They are about power, and the difference matters. The weight of that sentence hung over the room like thunderclouds. In the gallery, a woman whispered to the person beside her, her voice picked up faintly by the cameras. He's not just answering him, he's indicting him. The words echoed a truth many were already thinking. This wasn't just rebuttal, it was a moral confrontation staged live before the nation. And then, like the turning of a page, the chamber shifted again. The Constitution itself had been laid on the table, both literally and figuratively. The farm, the soil, the sweat of generations had been invoked as living testimony. And the question of what order truly meant was no longer abstract. It was flesh and blood lives on the line. Children and families staring down the possibility of loss. Denzel Washington drew in a slow breath, his hands folded once more. So tell me, Mr. Trump, he said, his voice calm but firm, when you laugh at equality, when you call this order, what exactly are you protecting? Because it is not the Constitution, it is not the people, it is only yourself. That last word hit with the weight of a verdict. The cameras captured Trump's reaction, jaw tightening, shoulders stiffening, eyes flashing with the anger of someone unaccustomed to being framed so clearly, so publicly. He shifted in his seat again, gripping his microphone as though it were an anchor. But before he could answer, the chair's gavel tapped once more, signaling the close of this round. And in that pause, as the nation leaned in, it became unmistakably clear. The hearing had ceased to be about abstract policy. It had become a courtroom for America's soul, and the verdict was being written in real time. By the 15-minute mark, the stakes had been fully revealed. This was no longer just a clash of personalities. It was a clash between words enshrined in the nation's founding and the attempt to redefine them through power and insult. The nation was watching, and the question on every viewer's mind was simple: what would happen next? The committee room had already shifted into something more than a hearing. It had become a stage where every word, every pause, every breath mattered. By the time the clock struck the 15-minute mark, America wasn't just watching, it was leaning forward. The insult had triggered the spark. The constitutional clash had sharpened the blade. And now Denzel Washington was preparing to drive the point home with something even more undeniable. Numbers, facts, the weight of public opinion carved into cold, hard data. He reached for the small clicker resting at his side. With one deliberate press, the monitors lining the chamber walls flickered to life. The static cleared, and then, filling the screens in bold, unmistakable letters, appeared the words, "More than 60% of Americans reject discriminatory deportation policies." The figure glowed against a dark background. Stark, impossible to ignore. The effect was immediate. A low murmur ran through the room, the kind of sound that rises when people see proof with their own eyes. Reporters tilted forward, cameras zoomed in on the screen, and the gallery leaned closer as if the sheer size of the number demanded their full attention. 60%, more than half the nation. Denzel let the silence do its work for a few seconds, his gaze sweeping across the room before he spoke. His tone was calm, steady, but filled with the certainty of someone who knew the numbers were his ally. This is not my opinion. This is not partisan spin. This is America. 6 in 10 of our fellow citizens, across party lines, across states, across backgrounds, stand against what is being proposed in your name, Mr. Trump. They know instinctively what you try to deny, that no person should be excluded because of the color of their skin. With another click, the screen shifted. A new phrase filled the monitors in stark white letters: "No one excluded by skin color." The words stood large, dominating the chamber, impossible to look away from. The silence stretched longer this time, broken only by the frantic sound of reporters typing, the sharp clicks of shutters capturing the slide from every angle. Even those who opposed Denzel knew the optics were devastating. To sit in silence while those words glared down from the walls was to be complicit. Trump shifted in his seat, his lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned forward as though about to argue, but Denzel raised his voice just enough to hold the floor. "You can laugh at equality, You can mock the Constitution, but you cannot laugh at 60% of the people you claim to represent. You cannot mock their will, their voice, their demand for justice. And then the feed changed again. ChatGPT said, this time the image was not numbers, but a live stream beamed directly into the hearing from a church in Alabama. The sanctuary was dimly lit, stained glass glowing faintly as afternoon sun filtered through. Standing at the pulpit was a man in his late 60s, his voice gravelly with age but strong with conviction. "My name is Reverend James," he began, looking into the camera with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the struggles of another era. "I preached my first sermon in this very church when the scars of Jim Crow were still raw. I remember the marches, the arrests, the nights we sang freedom songs to remind ourselves that the dawn would come. And now, decades later, I find myself standing before this congregation, singing again, not against the past, but against the policies you are trying to bring back." The church behind him stirred. Voices hummed softly, an echo of the old hymns rising beneath his words. "You cannot tell me this is about order. We know what order built on exclusion looks like. We buried friends under that order. We carried wounds under that order, and we swore on the steps of courthouses and in the pews of churches that our children would never have to fight those battles again." His voice grew sharper, the cadence of a preacher filling the hearing room even through the screen. And yet here we are. Here we are forced to raise our voices once more, not because we want to, but because silence is no longer an option. We will not let this country forget. We will not let this chamber forget. We are still here, and we are still singing. The live stream cut back to Denzel Washington, his expression grave but resolute. He let the Reverend's words linger in the room, their echo still pulsing like the aftershocks of a bell. "That," he said finally, voice measured but ringing, "is America. That is the voice that has carried this country forward through its darkest hours. And today, it is rising again. Not in anger, not in violence, but in truth." The hashtag truth over hate flared again across the bottom of screens nationwide, climbing higher in real-time charts. On live stream chats, viewers typed frantically, their words overlapping. "He's right. We've seen this before. History repeating itself. This is bigger than one man." Trump cleared his throat, gripping his microphone with both hands, his jaw tense. "This is nothing but theater," he said, his voice rising, straining. "It's politics. It's emotional manipulation. People want safety. People want borders. People want leaders who are willing to make tough choices. That's what I'm doing. It's not about hate. It's about protecting America." But his words sounded thinner now, weaker against the avalanche of evidence, history, and live voices piling up against him. Denzel leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Protecting America," he repeated, "by excluding Americans. Protecting liberty by denying liberty. Protecting equality by mocking equality. Do you hear yourself?" He let the question hang, his eyes fixed on Trump, daring him to answer. The camera zoomed in, catching the tightness around Trump's mouth, the flicker in his eyes as he looked down at the papers before him. The room was tense again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't shock. It wasn't disbelief. It was anticipation. The awareness that something was cracking, that Trump's defense was beginning to sound hollow against the tide of voices and evidence. And Denzel, sensing the moment, folded his hands once more. "You can dismiss me. You can dismiss the student, the farmer, the reverend. But you cannot dismiss the people. You cannot dismiss the numbers. You cannot dismiss the Constitution. And the more you try, the more this nation will see you for what you are." The words landed like hammer blows, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was a vacuum, pulling every listener deeper into the unfolding confrontation. By the 20th minute, the chamber had been transformed again. What started with insult had become indictment, backed now by data and by the living testimony of a people who refused to be silenced. And as America watched, the question grew sharper, heavier, unavoidable. How much longer could Trump hold the line against the truth pressing in on every side? The data on the giant screen still glowed when Trump leaned into his microphone again. His face was tight, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a jagged edge. "This is nothing but a performance," and he snapped. "All these slides, all these so-called witnesses, they don't change what this is really about. Immigration, security, order. That's what matters. And that has nothing to do with race. Not one thing." His words landed heavy, as if he wanted to pull the hearing back under his control. He straightened in his chair, crossed his arms, and allowed a smirk to flicker at the corners of his mouth, as though daring Denzel Washington to press him further. He thought he had thrown up a wall, a barrier of denial strong enough to shield him from the charge Denzel had built. But Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned forward slowly, folding his hands together on the table. His voice dropped lower, calmer, the kind of tone that forces a room to lean in rather than recoil. "Not about race," he repeated. "Then let's test that." Trump tilted his head, suspicion flickering across his face. Denzel held his gaze. "You like to say we. You've said it over and over. We the people, we as a nation, we must restore order. So I'm going to ask you plainly, and I want you to answer plainly. Who exactly is we?" His words sliced through the chamber like a scalpel. For 6 long seconds there was nothing. The silence thickened again, broken only by the faint buzz of the lights overhead and the scratch of a pen still mid-note. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, his lips pressed together. His eyes darted briefly to the side as though searching for the right angle, the right escape. The smirk was gone. Denzel didn't move. He sat still, his voice echoing again with the same cold precision. "Define us." The silence grew unbearable. Viewers at home leaned forward, waiting. Live comment threads exploded with the same question. Will he answer? Can he answer? Does he even dare? Finally, Trump cleared his throat, his words halting. "We means Americans. It means citizens. It means people who belong here." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, vague, slippery, designed to give nothing away. But Denzel pounced immediately. People who belong here. And who decides that? Who decides who belongs, Mr. Trump? Is it the farmer whose family has tilled American soil for 3 generations? The student who spends sleepless nights studying medicine to save lives in this country? The reverend who still sings the songs that once pushed America forward? Or do you mean something else entirely when you say we? Trump shifted again, irritation flashing across his features. "It's about law. It's about rules. It's about keeping people safe." Denzel cut in swiftly. "No, it's about lines you draw and lines you erase. Because every example we've heard today, every voice you've dismissed, meets the definition of American. And yet, in your words, they remain outsiders. That is not safety. That is not order. That is exclusion. Plain and simple." The chamber buzzed again. The low rumble of recognition spread through both lawmakers and observers. The word exclusion hung like a verdict. And then the large monitor flickered once more. A new face appeared. This time, a man seated in front of a glowing laptop screen, the skyline of Seattle visible faintly behind him. His shirt collar was open, his expression weary but determined. He adjusted his glasses before speaking. "My name is Marcus," he said. "I'm a software engineer. I've spent the last decade building the tools Americans use every single day. You check your bank account? I help design the security protocols. You send an email? Chances are some piece of the infrastructure came from my team. I pay my taxes. I vote. I mentor students in STEM programs because I believe in passing forward the opportunities I was given. And yet, despite all of that, I still hear people in power talk about me as though I'm an outsider, as though the country I've poured my skills into can shrug and call me disposable." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice firm. "You don't get to use my work every day and then turn around and tell me I don't belong. That's the contradiction. That's the lie." The chamber was silent again. Even Trump's defenders glanced down, unwilling to meet the force of the testimony displayed before them. Denzel seized the moment, his voice calm but piercing, cut across the silence. "This is the America you say you are protecting. The very engineers who keep our systems running. The very people whose skills, whose labor, whose brilliance keep us competitive in the world. And yet in your we, they are not included. Tell me, Mr. Trump, how safe is a country that discards its builders? How strong is a nation that erases its own backbone? The question hung like thunder. Trump shifted again, his hands clenching into fists on the table. His voice rose sharper now, defensive. I never said they weren't important. I never said they weren't contributors. But we have laws. And if you don't have the right papers, you don't belong here, no matter what you've done. Denzel's voice grew colder, steadier. Each word measured. The right papers. That's your test. Not contribution, not loyalty, not sacrifice, but a line drawn on a piece of paper. And if that line happens to fall along skin color, heritage, or origin, then so be it. That's what you call order. She paused, her gaze unblinking. The rest of us call it discrimination. The words reverberated through the chamber, caught and carried instantly by the cameras, the microphones, the feeds flowing outward to millions watching. On social platforms, the phrase began to trend immediately. The rest of us call it discrimination. Viewers repeated it, typed it, turned it into captions and clips, knowing instinctively it was the line that would frame the night. Trump leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting across the room. He tried to summon another smirk, but it faltered. The wall he thought he had built was cracking, and the nation was watching the cracks spread in real time. Denzel Washington sat back slightly, his hands folded again, his voice soft but cutting. You may dismiss the farmer, the student, the reverend, the engineer, but you cannot dismiss the question. You cannot dismiss the silence that came before you answered. And you cannot dismiss what your answer revealed, that your we is not America. It is a smaller circle drawn to keep power for yourself. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, undeniable. Everyone in the room knew what had just happened. Trump had tried to turn the tide with denial, but Denzel had forced him to expose the exclusion at the heart of his words. By the 30th minute, the battle lines were clearer than ever. This was no longer just about insults or numbers. It was about who gets to define America. And as the hearing rolled forward, one truth became harder and harder to deny. Trump's definition was shrinking, while Denzel's was expanding, fueled by voices the nation could not ignore. The tension in the chamber was already heavy when Denzel reached for the stack of folders at his side. Every camera lens followed the movement of his hand, the anticipation sharp enough to cut the silence. He had listened patiently. He had let Trump try to defend himself, and he had exposed the cracks in his answers. Now it was time to move from questions and testimony to something harder, something written, something he could not laugh away. With deliberate slowness, he pulled out a single manila folder. Its edges were creased, the paper inside marked with official stamps that looked far too real to dismiss as rumor. He held it in his hands for a moment, letting the room feel the weight of suspense, and then laid it flat on the table in front of him. The microphones caught the faint rustle of the paper, a sound louder than any gavel. His eyes locked on Trump, his voice calm, precise. For the record, he began, this committee has received a document that was not meant to see the light of day. A memo prepared inside your own office. A memo that does not speak of safety, that does not speak of sovereignty, that does not speak of law. It speaks of something else entirely. Trump shifted in his chair, his lips tightening. Fake, he muttered before Denzel had even unfolded it. It's a fake. I haven't even seen it, and I can tell you it's fake. Denzel ignored the interruption. He slid the paper out from the folder, the black ink sharp against the white page, and held it up for the cameras to capture. This memo, he said, his voice steady, outlines a plan. The language is cold, clinical. It uses the phrase residency screening, but buried within its lines is the truth. It is a policy proposal built not on law, not on fairness, but on race. He read directly from the page, his tone measured, deliberate. Priority groups for removal shall be determined by demographic markers, including but not limited to ethnic origin. The words hit the chamber like a shock wave. Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters shot to their feet, phones held high, cameras clicking furiously to capture every angle of the document in his hands. The gallery erupted in murmurs, rising almost to shouts, until the committee chair tapped his gavel in a futile attempt to quiet the noise. Denzel didn't flinch. He laid the memo flat on the table, the text angled perfectly for the cameras. "This," he said, his voice cutting through the commotion, "is what you call order, a system that reduces Americans to categories, a plan to sort families, to divide neighbors, to mark people for removal, not because of crime, not because of threat, but because of who they are. This is not about security. This is not about borders. This is about race." The hashtag #NoOneAboveEquality lit up instantly across live feeds, rising beside #TruthOverHate. Comment sections flooded with disbelief and outrage. Viewers replayed the clip of Denzel reading the line again and again, some with captions, some slowed down, each share fanning the fire. Trump leaned forward, his voice rising, tinged with fury. "It's fake. It's manufactured. This is exactly what you people do." ChatGPT said, "You make up lies. You drag them in here and you call it evidence. I've never seen that document in my life. Total hoax, total fraud." But Denzel Washington was ready. His hand hovered over another folder. He slid out a single sheet and held it up like a trump card. "This is the metadata, the digital fingerprint of this memo, and it traces directly back to the servers of your office." The room erupted again. Shouts, gasps, the rapid-fire clicking of cameras. A senator leaned forward, squinting at the evidence as Denzel laid it beside the memo. Date of creation, the 12th of July. Author, Office of the President. Location, Executive Server. Cluster 3. He turned back to Trump. "So tell me again, Mr. Trump, fake or simply inconvenient?" Trump's face flushed, his jaw clenched, his hand gripped the microphone so tightly the veins on his wrist bulged. For a moment he seemed poised to stand, to shout over Denzel. But the cameras had him pinned. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on his reaction, and for once silence offered him no escape. Denzel leaned back slightly, letting the silence deepen. His voice finally broke through, calm but final. "The truth doesn't need permission to exist. It doesn't need your signature. It doesn't need your approval. It simply is. And today, it is written in your own words." The monitor flickered again. A new face appeared. A young girl, her hair neatly braided, her hands trembling as she held a sheet of paper. She was no politician, no adult with years of rhetoric in her pocket. She was 12 years old, speaking from her small kitchen table in New York. The hum of a refrigerator behind her. Her voice quivered, but she read anyway. "My name is Anna. My mom and dad work hard every day. My dad cooks at a restaurant. My mom cleans offices at night. They tell me I should study hard so I can be the first in my family to be a lawyer. But when I hear about these plans, I get scared. What if they take my parents away? Who will make dinner for me? Who will walk me to school? Who will tell me everything will be okay?" Her words cracked on the last line, her eyes flicking up at the camera, wide-eyed and uncertain. For a long, unbearable second, the hearing room was silent. Reporters who had been scribbling non-stop lowered their pens. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even Trump looked away, his gaze breaking under the weight of a child's fear. Denzel's voice returned, quiet but resolute. "This is who your memo threatens. Not criminals, not strangers, children, families, lives built here in this country, under this flag." The chamber felt heavier now, not with noise, but with the gravity of what had been revealed. No denial could erase the text on the page, the metadata on the screen, the trembling voice of a 12-year-old pleading for the simple certainty of her parents at the dinner table. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room and to millions watching across the nation that the hearing had reached a breaking point. The game of denial and deflection was collapsing under the weight of paper, ink, and truth. By the 30th minute, the chamber was no longer just tense. It was fractured. The wall Trump had built around his words had cracked wide open, and through those cracks poured not just facts, but faces, voices, and stories the nation could not look away from. Trump's denial still echoed in the chamber, when Denzel placed the memo flat on the table again. He leaned into his microphone, his voice rising with anger that barely masked his unease. This document is fake. It's manufactured, doctored, whatever word you want to use. This is the kind of garbage you people bring into hearings to smear me. Everyone knows it. His words rushed out quickly, as if he believed speed might substitute for proof. But Denzel didn't flinch. He slid another page across the polished wood, a printout covered in lines of data, numbers, and timestamps. His tone was crisp, calm, surgical. For the record, this is the metadata associated with the memo created on July 12th. Timestamp, 2:41 p.m. Location, Executive Office Server, Cluster 3. Author tag, Office of the President's Staff Account. The words landed harder than any shout. The chamber filled with the rapid clicking of cameras, flashes lighting the room. Reporters whispered frantically, already drafting headlines. Metadata-tized memo to Trump's office. Trump's face hardened, his lips pulled tight. His eyes flicked toward his lawyers, seated just behind him, as though searching for a lifeline. But no one moved. The evidence was sitting in plain sight, caught by every lens. Denzel leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but piercing. You can dismiss me. You can dismiss this committee, but you cannot dismiss digital fingerprints. They don't lie. They don't spin. They don't play politics. They simply reveal where something began. And this memo began with you. The silence that followed was crushing. Trump shifted in his seat, tugged at his cuff, and muttered again. Fake. But softer this time, his voice lacking the force it carried before. And then the monitors flickered once more. This time the feed wasn't of a reverend or a farmer. It was of a child. A 12-year-old girl sat at a small kitchen table, her hands clutching a piece of lined notebook paper. The hum of a refrigerator filled the background. Her voice shook as she read, My name is Anika. My dad cooks in a restaurant and my mom cleans offices at night. They tell me to work hard so I can be the first in my family to be a lawyer. But when I hear about plans like this, I get scared. What if they take my parents away? Who will walk me to school? Who will cook dinner? Who will tell me it's going to be okay? Her voice cracked on the last words. She lowered the paper, looking straight into the camera with wee, fearful eyes. For a moment, the entire chamber froze. Lawmakers who had spent years sparring in this room lowered their gaze. Reporters put down their pens. Even Trump, caught on camera, looked away. Denzel Washington's voice returned, soft but unyielding. This is who your memo targets. Not criminals, not strangers, families, children. A little girl who just wants her parents to be there when she gets home from school. The chamber felt heavy, thick with the weight of a truth too human to spin. Denzel pressed further, his words steady. Tell me, Mr. Trump, when you call this fake, are you saying her fear is fake? Are you saying her voice doesn't matter? Because I assure you, millions of children like her are listening right now, and they will remember your answer. Trump's jaw worked, but no words came immediately. The camera zoomed in, capturing the tightness in his face, the flicker of discomfort breaking through his usual bluster. Denzel sat back, folding his hands calmly. The hashtags erupted across social media in real time. Hashtag no one above equality. Hash truth over hate. Had her voice matters. Live feeds lit up with comments. She's 12. She's braver than he is. This is the moment. For the first time in the hearing, Trump looked small, cornered not by politicians or lawyers, but by the trembling words of a child and the cold precision of digital receipts. By the 35th minute, it was no longer a question of whether the memo was real. The evidence, the metadata, the human testimony had collapsed his denial. The question now was far sharper. What would the nation do with the truth? The chamber was still heavy with the echo of the young girl's trembling words when the unthinkable happened. From the far side of the dais, a voice cut through the silence. Not Denzel's, not Trump's, but one of Trump's own allies. A senior congressman, long known for his loyalty, leaned toward his microphone. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. The camera swung toward him, sensing something rare, something about to crack open. "I have to say this," he began, his tone unsteady but resolute. "We cannot pretend that what we've just seen is fabricated. I've reviewed the metadata myself. I've seen the stamps. This document is authentic." The room erupted. Gasps rolled across the gallery. Reporters leapt to their feet, shouting into phones and cameras. Cameramen swung their lenses toward the congressman, capturing every flicker of doubt in his face. Even the committee chair looked stunned, his gavel frozen midair, as though he had forgotten what it was for. Trump turned sharply, his face red with disbelief, his hands slamming against the table. "You're wrong," he snapped, his voice thick with anger. "You're reading it wrong, or you're being tricked. You don't know what you're talking about. That memo isn't mine. It isn't ours. It's a lie." But the congressman didn't back down. His eyes moved slowly across the chamber, pausing on the young girl's face, still frozen on the screen, her letter now replaying silently as networks looped the clip. "I've been in this chamber long enough to know when we've crossed a line," he said, "and I can't in good conscience sit here and say nothing. The people deserve the truth." Denzel seized the moment with the precision of a blade. His voice was calm but commanding, cutting through the rising noise. "Thank you," he said, turning back to Trump, "because the truth has a way of breaking through even the strongest walls. You can deny me. You can deny the farmer, the reverend, the engineer, the child. But when your own allies begin to acknowledge what you refuse, the silence you've hidden behind starts to collapse." The camera zoomed in on Trump. His smirk was gone. His face was tight, his eyes darting between the congressman, Denzel Washington, and the roaring press pen. He reached for his microphone again, but his words came out jagged. "This is a witch hunt, nothing more. They want to destroy me, and now even some of my own people are too weak to stand with me. But I will not bow, I will not apologize." His voice was louder now, but it didn't land with strength. It landed with desperation. Denzel leaned in, his voice low but cutting, his gaze steady. "Mr. Trump, how many people are you willing to trample to hold on to power? How many families must live in fear? How many children must wonder if their parents will disappear? What number makes you feel safe in that chair?" The room stilled again. His words rang out like a verdict. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Scribes paused mid-note. Even the gavel did not fall. Outside the chamber, the crowd's chants grew louder, carried through the walls like a drumbeat. "Justice for all, justice for all." Protesters waved handmade signs. "America belongs to everyone. Families belong together." Their voices rose in unison, the sound reaching into the hearing, echoing through microphones, reminding everyone inside that the nation was listening, that the walls could not hold back the tide. Trump's eyes darted toward the sound. For the first time, his posture slumped slightly, as if the chants were pressing down on his shoulders. He tried to smile to project control, but the cameras caught the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes. Denzel let the silence build once more before speaking, his tone steady, almost solemn. "The choice is no longer just yours, Mr. Trump. The evidence is before us. The people are outside these walls, and even within your own ranks, the truth is breaking through. You can deny it, but you cannot escape it." By the 40th minute, the hearing had tipped into something larger than confrontation. It had become collapse, of denial, of loyalty, of the fragile wall that once held Trump's narrative together. And America, watching live, knew it. The question was no longer if the truth would outlast him. It was how soon. The roar outside the Capitol had been building all afternoon, but by the time the chamber reached its breaking point, it was impossible to ignore. The chants carried through the stone walls, vibrating in the microphones and seeping into the live broadcast. "Justice for all, justice for all." The words rolled like thunder, steady, unrelenting, growing louder with every passing second. Cameras positioned outside cut into the feed. A sea of people stretched across the steps and sidewalks. Signs lifted high into the humid air. Some were hand-painted, streaks of red and blue letters across white cardboard. Others were printed in bold block text that left no room for doubt. America belongs to everyone. Equality means everyone. Families belong together. The voices of the crowd merged into one force, a living chorus that gave shape to the outrage spilling beyond the chamber walls. A woman in her 60s stood near the front, holding a sign made from an old bedsheet, the fabric flapping in the breeze. Her voice cracked as she shouted, but she never stopped. Beside her, a group of college students live-streamed the scene, their phones raised high. The chat feeds on those streams scrolled so fast it was almost unreadable. "This is history. I can't believe we're watching this live." Shouts, "Truth over hate," had new one, "Above equality." Inside the chamber, the noise was impossible to ignore. Even Trump turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes as though he could block out the sound by sheer force of will. But the microphones picked it up clearly, piping the chants into the hearing itself, making the people outside impossible to erase. Denzel let the sound fill the silence for a moment before he spoke again, his voice calm but cutting. "Do you hear that? That is the voice of America, not the silence of fear, not the smirk of denial. The voice of people who will not let their neighbors be erased." The crowd surged again as if answering him. "Justice for all." The chant echoed so powerfully that for a moment it felt as if the chamber and the steps outside were connected by one single voice. Reporters rushed to the windows, snapping photos of the gathering storm. Producers in newsrooms cut live to aerial footage from helicopters circling overhead. The sheer size of the crowd spreading across television screens across the country. Headlines began to roll instantly. Washington, hearing sparks, mass demonstration. Americans pour into the streets. ChatGPT said, on social media, the hashtags erupted. Hashtag truth over. Hate hit #1 within minutes, trending across platforms in multiple languages. No one above equality followed closely behind, with millions of posts flooding timelines. And a new one appeared, organically born from the chants outside. Justice for all. Viewers clipped the moment the girl's trembling voice overlapped with the crowd's chant, stitching it into a viral video that spread faster than any campaign ad ever could. In living rooms, coffee shops, subway trains, and break rooms, people watched and felt something stir. A teacher in Detroit texted her colleagues, "Are you watching this? Our students need to see it." A veteran in Arizona posted a video of himself tearing up as the chant echoed from his phone. "I fought for this flag, and this is what it should sound like." Back inside, Trump shifted in his chair, his face hardening, but the cameras caught the telltale flicker of unease in his eyes. He leaned toward his microphone, trying to raise his voice above the chant. "This is nothing but noise," he barked. "Paid protesters, the same people who show up every time. It doesn't mean anything." But his words landed flat, drowned almost instantly by the chants outside and the flood of voices online. The people were louder. The hashtags were faster. The tide had shifted, and denial sounded smaller with every passing second. Denzel Washington's gaze never wavered. He spoke again, his tone sharper now. "Noise? That's what you call it? Then let me tell you what I hear. I hear students who refuse to let their future be stolen. I hear families demanding safety in their own homes. I hear communities saying they belong, that their voices count, that their rights are not yours to erase. That is not noise. That is democracy." The crowd erupted again, as if in direct response. "Democracy! Democracy!" The chant changed, rising in volume until the stone steps seemed to shake beneath the weight of it. Lawmakers glanced nervously at one another, some shifting in their seats, some tapping their pens against their folders. They knew what this meant. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a movement. Denzel leaned back slightly, letting the chants continue, his eyes never leaving Trump's face. "You can sit here and pretend you don't hear them. You can call it noise, but the rest of America hears them, and the rest of America will remember which side of the chant you sat on." The silence in the chamber now was filled not by emptiness, but by the relentless, undeniable voice of the people outside. By the 45th minute, the hearing had become something more than testimony, more than argument. It had become a reckoning, fueled by data, voices, and now a crowd that refused to be silenced. The confrontation was no longer just between Denzel and Trump. It was between one man and a nation that had risen outside his walls. Trump gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. The chants outside, justice for all, democracy, echoed through the chamber like a second heartbeat. His voice, when it came, was louder than before, almost desperate to drown them out. "This isn't about America," he barked, leaning forward until the microphone trembled. "This is about me. It's a personal attack. You've turned this entire room into a circus. Lies, hoaxes, Bob's outside screaming because you want them to scream. It's not oversight. It's a witch hunt, nothing more." The words spilled out fast, his tone harsher than at any point in the hearing. But the cameras caught it. The tightness in his jaw, the quick glance downward, the strain in his voice. The performance didn't sound commanding anymore. It sounded defensive. Denzel let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He let the anger ring in the chamber until it began to feel hollow, until even Trump's allies shifted uneasily in their seats. And then, with the precision of a scalpel, he leaned forward. His voice was calm, cold, cutting. "No," he said evenly. "This is not a personal attack. This is oversight." The words landed with the weight of a verdict. 6 seconds of silence followed, long, suffocating, unforgettable. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face. He tried to hold Denzel's gaze, but his eyes flicked away, breaking contact. The microphones picked up his shallow breath, the sound of a man cornered. Denzel's tone sharpened as he pressed the point. Oversight is not optional. It is not a game. It is the duty of this body, the responsibility written into the Constitution. When a president, any president, uses their office to promote policies built on fear, on exclusion, on lies, it is our obligation to confront it, not with smirks, not with insults, with facts, with evidence, with truth. He paused, folding his hands, his gaze still locked on him. "That is what today is. And the fact that you call it personal says more about you than it does about me." The silence stretched again. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the exchange would headline every broadcast that evening. On social feeds, the clip of his words looped instantly. The line, "This is not a personal attack, this is oversight," turning into text overlays, stitched into viral videos carried by the hashtags already surging. Trump shifted back in his chair, his jaw set, but he didn't respond. For the first time, he avoided the camera. The lenses caught the telltale flicker of his eyes, the downward glance, the visible discomfort of a man unaccustomed to silence. Denzel Washington leaned in once more, his voice low, deliberate. "You've told on yourself, Mr. Trump, because when accountability feels like an attack, it means you've built something that cannot survive the light. And today, that light is here." Outside, the chant surged again as if punctuating his words. "Your truth over hate, truth over hate." The rhythm carried through the stone walls, into the microphones, through every speaker and television broadcasting the hearing live. For a moment, the chamber felt frozen in time. Trump sunk back in his chair, Denzel steady as stone, the crowd outside louder than ever. The air was thick with a silence that wasn't empty, but decisive, as if the nation itself were leaning in to witness the balance of power shift before their eyes. By the 50th minute, it was no longer about whether Trump could fight back. It was about the fact that he hadn't. He sat under the lights, his voice spent, while Denzel's words echoed across the nation. Oversight, not a personal attack. A principle older than him, stronger than him, impossible to erase. The chamber was quiet now, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from calm, but from exhaustion, from the weight of something undeniable finally settling in. Trump sat back in his chair, jaw tight, his eyes cast downward, his voice absent. The chants outside had become the soundtrack of the hearing. Steady, unbroken, louder than anything he could say. Truth over hate, equality for all. The sound poured through the stone walls, into the microphones, into millions of homes across the country. Denzel leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every ear was already tuned to him, every camera fixed on his face. He drew in a breath, and when he spoke, his words landed with the solemnity of a closing argument, not just to Trump, but to the nation itself. Let's be clear about what happened here today. This is not about one man's insult. It It is not about one leaked memo. It is not even about one hearing. This is about who we are and who we choose to be. He paused, his eyes sweeping the chamber, then lifted them to meet the camera directly. When you insult the color of my skin, you insult millions. When you propose policies that divide by race, you don't just break promises, you break the Constitution. And when you try to dismiss accountability as a personal attack, you tell every American child that truth has no place in power. That is not who we are. That is not who we can be. The silence deepened, but outside the chants surged again, now unified into one word: equality, equality, equality. It was a single drumbeat, rising from thousands of voices, echoing through streets and screens, impossible to ignore. Denzel's voice grew stronger, his cadence deliberate, resonant. I've read your words today. I've shown your data. But more importantly, I've carried the voices of this country into this chamber. A student who fears she will never be a doctor. A farmer who worries his family will lose their land. A reverend who remembers marching against Jim Crow. An engineer who builds the very tools America depends on. And a 12-year-old girl trembling as she asked who would walk her to school if her parents were taken. These are not statistics. These are Americans. They are the true meaning of we the people. Images of each witness appeared on the monitors, their faces filling the screen one by one. The student with her letter, the farmer in his field, the reverend at his pulpit, the engineer before his laptop, the little girl at her kitchen table. Their voices echoed softly, overlapping into a chorus. We belong. We are part of this country. We will not be erased. Denzel's gaze remained steady. So today I ask not just Mr. Trump, but the entire nation. Who do we choose to be? A country that shrinks its circle until only a few remain inside, or a country that widens it until no one is left out? A country built on fear, or a country lifted by equality? The camera zoomed closer. His eyes were unblinking, his words deliberate. The answer matters because history will not just record what was said in this chamber. It will record what we chose to do. The crowd outside erupted again, the chant now matching his words. Equality, equality. The sound shook the steps, rolled down the avenues, echoed across screens nationwide. Denzel leaned back slightly, his tone softening but carrying even greater weight. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a reckoning, a reminder that no memo, no insult, no denial can erase what is true. And the truth is this: a nation is only as strong as its commitment to every single one of its people, every child, every worker, every dreamer, every neighbor, every voice. He turned directly to the camera, his voice steady, resonant. The question before us is simple. Do we choose truth or do we choose hate? Because one will lead us forward, the other will destroy us. The feed cut to a wide shot, the chamber, the lawmakers, the press, the sea of protesters outside. The chants were deafening now, one word pounding like a heartbeat. Equality, equality, equality. On screen, 3 hashtags rose in bold letters. Had truth, over hate, #justice, for all, #no one, above equality. The narration closed over the image, calm but resolute. A nation is only strong when no one is cast aside. A democracy only survives when truth speaks louder than power. And the truth will never be silent. As the screen faded to black, the chant carried on, leaving the audience with the echo of a question that demanded not just reflection, but an answer.